Crying in H-Mart, a memoir. This book was written by Michelle Zauner and was published by Vintage 2023. The following 4 books analysis will provide us with a hands-on and immediately engaging insight into Korean culture and cuisine, while at the same time enabling us to appreciate the challenge of trying to fit in as a second-generation American, and helping us to explore the ways in which our culture can help us cope with the grief of losing a loved one. Before we dive into our analysis of the book, however, let's take a quick look at the author's background. Michelle Zauner is a Korean-American writer and musician who is best known as the lead singer and guitarist of the indie rock band Japanese Breakfast. She is the daughter of an American and a Korean and was born in Seoul but moved to Oregon when she was 9 months old. Years later, her mother died, still at a young age, of cancer, and after her death, Michelle wrote an essay in Glamour magazine and a memoir, Crying in H-Mart. Japanese Breakfast has released the albums Psychopomp, Soft Sounds from Another Planet, and Jubilee. Michelle is married to musician Peter Bradley Adams. And now let's hear about the book, starting with the first main theme. Food is one way of passing on a people's culture and also helps us to remember people who are no longer with us. Ever since her mother passed away from cancer at the age of 56, Michelle Zauner has often found herself crying in an H-Mart, the largest chain of Asian supermarkets in the United States. It is the only place where she feels able to reconnect with the memory of her mother and where she can still imagine her cooking or shopping for traditional Korean foods. Now that her mother is gone, Michelle often wonders if she should still even consider herself Korean because she no longer has access to her mother's great source of knowledge on Korean culture. Her mother showed her love for her family mainly through food and cooking, and now Michelle often feels sad and angry when she sees families or elderly people happily eating at a typical Asian cultural venue, as her mother is no longer able to do the same. H-Marts are usually found in American suburbs, in neighborhoods where signs in Chinese or Korean are common, and in Asian shopping centers. Michelle's local H-Mart is in Elkins Park near Philadelphia, and she goes there every week to stock up. The shop's food court is full of stalls and kiosks serving typical dishes from all over Asia, including sushi, ramen, and tteokbokki, typical Korean rice dumplings. Every time she goes there, Michelle watches the people eating and wonders how many of them are also missing a loved one. Michelle Zauner lost both her mother and her aunt to cancer in the space of just 5 years, and now she is only able to remember them as they used to be, before the disease, standing in the aisles of an H-Mart. Michelle was 25 years old when her mother Chong-mi died, and she still remembers all of her mother's favorite dishes. Her parents met in South Korea while her American father was in the country on business, and Chong-mi was a receptionist at the hotel where he was staying. After dating for about 3 months, they got engaged and traveled around the world for several years before returning to Seoul, where Michelle was born. When Michelle was almost a year old, the family moved to a house in the rural area of Eugene, Oregon. Michelle spent most of her time with her mother because there were no other children for her to play with in the neighborhood. A difficult childhood and summers in Seoul. Outwardly, Chong-mi was not a particularly loving mother and was always very strict with Michelle. She was a perfectionist and was obsessed with beauty, her body, clothes, and tidiness, and constantly bought creams and skincare products from the shopping channel QVC. As a child, Michelle found this exhausting, but still wanted to be with her mother and constantly sought her approval. She learnt to clean and to keep everything tidy so that her mother would be pleased and compliment her. Michelle also tried to earn her mother's praise through Korean food, even though she herself had acquired a decidedly Americanized palate. Michelle grew up with the firm belief that food is a part of a person's cultural identity. She spent about 6 weeks every year with her mother visiting family in Seoul. They would stay with Michelle's halmoni, grandmother in Korean, in a house where her nammy Imo is Korean for maternal aunt, also lived with her husband, Mr. Kim, and their teenage son, Seong-young. Eunmi Imo, a young university graduate and unofficial translator, also lived in the house, and she and Michelle became firm friends. Michelle and her mother slept on a futon in the living room, and at night, Chong-mi would regularly raid the fridge for some good Korean home cooking, something that she never did at home. Michelle does not have particularly fond memories of her grandmother, who would always tease her and sometimes even be mean to her. Halmoni would play a typical Korean joke on Michelle called dongchim that involved sticking a finger up another person's anus. She met her grandfather just once, as he had abandoned the family when her mother was a teenager. Michelle discovered that she was very beautiful by Korean standards, as having a double eyelid is considered so attractive that her aunts even resorted to cosmetic surgery to have an eyelid crease added to their own eyelids. One day, Michelle was approached by a TV director who wanted her to appear in his show, but her mother refused to allow her to become someone's doll. These visits to Korea lasted until Michelle was 14 when her grandmother died. When Chongmi came back from the funeral, she was completely devastated, but Michelle did not realize what it would mean to lose her own mother. Michelle's teenage years and the conflicted relationship with her mother. From an early age and throughout her teenage years, Michelle's family would call her the famous bad girl due to her strong and somewhat complicated personality. Her father used to say that Michelle got her temperament from him. He was a former drug addict, and as a teenager, he also spent time in prison for selling methamphetamine. One of the few moments of freedom Michelle was allowed was when she would sleep over at her friend Nicole's house. Nicole's mother, Colette, was a dreamer and a free spirit and had a very happy and peaceful relationship with her own daughter. Michelle thought Colette was the perfect mother. As a teenager, she would criticize her own mother for having no ambition and only realized as an adult how full and meaningful her mother's life as a mother and homemaker actually was. In the meantime, she discovered a passion for music and started going to indie rock concerts. She was inspired by Karen O of the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, and seeing an artist of Korean descent perform on stage gave her the push she needed to believe in herself and in her own potential. Michelle's mother did not approve of her daughter's passion for music, but nonetheless bought her a guitar and paid for her music lessons. Michelle started dating Nick, a classmate from school who was in a band, and she soon started playing and performing with them. One day, while having lunch at a Korean restaurant, Michelle and her mother had a huge argument because Chongmi wanted her to give up music and concentrate on her studies. Michelle said that she did not want to go to university and moved in with Colette and Nicole for a while, then with another friend, and finally went to live in a house full of punk rockers. When she returned home, her mother sent her to therapy, but their relationship continued to be very confrontational. They argued about everything, even trivial matters such as clothes, and her mother even went as far as to hit Michelle. During one particularly heated argument, Chongmi told Michelle that she had an abortion after she was born because she was so scared of having another terrible child. Michelle returns home after she hears of her mother's illness. Her mother was diagnosed with cancer 4 years after Michelle finished university. She was living in Philadelphia and had already embarked on her musical career. During her teenage years, tensions with her mother had escalated and she had decided to go to college to get away from home. The news of her mother's illness was a huge shock. By this time, Michelle was already going out with Peter, who she had met in a Mexican restaurant where she worked as a waitress and was living with her friend Ian, the drummer in her band. Peter was the first boyfriend her mother had approved of because the first time he met Michelle's parents, he took them to a restaurant that made sundubu jigae, a Korean tofu stew, which immediately made a good impression. Michelle's parents appreciated Peter's interest in their Korean culture. Michelle decided to move back home to be with her mother during her illness and saw it as a chance to fix their relationship. She quit her job, stopped touring with the band, and moved back to Eugene. On her way home, she made sure that she looked smart and presentable for her mother. Despite their complicated relationship, Michelle recognized that her mother had always taken care of her, sending her parcels of clothes and Korean food during her college years. Her father picked her up from the airport, and Michelle also gradually began to think about his role in her life. His past as a drug addict had affected his entire life, and he had only ever been concerned with supporting his family from a financial perspective. He had several extramarital affairs throughout Michelle's teenage years. His own father had been violent towards him, he had been physically abused, and had been introduced to drugs by an uncle at a very early age. As a result, he had a really tough adolescence, and he was a troubled man. When she arrived home, Michelle tried to learn how to cook Korean dishes so that she could take care of her mother, but Chongmi only wanted tomato juice and asked for Kai, a family friend, to take care of her. Michelle sat in her childhood bedroom and thought about how things had changed since she had lived there. She wanted to make her mother happy, so she went to Sunrise Market, the closest thing in Eugene to an H-Mart, but she felt terribly alone and lost among the aisles of the shop. Her mother refused to eat anything during her treatment, and day after day, Michelle became increasingly frustrated. When the doctor decided it was time to transfer Chongmi to hospital, Michelle stayed there with her. After 2 weeks, her mother was sent home and Michelle completely took over her care. She saw that her mother's body was changing and that she was losing her hair due to the treatment, and she tried her best to reassure her. Michelle reconnects with her Korean culture in order to be closer to her mother. After 3 weeks, Michelle's mother slowly began to get her strength back, and with Kai in the house once again, the atmosphere became much more calm and peaceful. Chongmi would call Kai Uni, which means big sister in Korean, and is also used to describe a very close friend. Michelle became obsessed with fitness, working out at the gym and running. As a child, she had never enjoyed gymnastics because she felt so different from the others in her class, and seeing as she wasn't Chinese or Japanese, the other children had trouble identifying with her. She hated her diversity, and one day while she was complaining about being the only Korean girl in school, her mother replied that she was not Korean but American. Kai's presence in the house was crucial because Michelle's mother would only eat what Kai prepared and even agreed to let Kai shave her hair. Michelle wanted to learn to cook Korean dishes so that she could take care of her mother. She also learnt which medicines her mother had to take and carefully monitored the gradual progression of her illness. One day, while they were driving back from the clinic, Michelle put Tell Him by Barbra Streisand and Celine Dion on the radio, remembering all the happy times they had shared singing the song together. Kai, however, gradually became increasingly invasive in Chongmi's life, taking over the running of the house and shutting everyone else out. She even wrote letters to Chongmi in Korean but refused to translate the content for anyone. The medication made it hard for Michelle's mother to think clearly, and she began to only speak in Korean, which made Michelle feel even more excluded. Shortly before her mother's diagnosis, Michelle had traveled to Seoul with her parents for her aunt Eunmi's funeral, who died at the age of 48 from colon cancer, and Chongmi formed even stronger ties with her community after her sister's death. While her mother underwent chemotherapy, Michelle started playing and touring with her band again, while Peter started working as a docent professor. While in Tennessee, Michelle received a call from her father telling her that her mother's tumor had not shrunk and that her mother wanted to stop chemotherapy. Chongmi also wanted to return to Korea with Michelle to show her all the places she had not yet seen. The passing of her mother and her marriage to Peter. Before returning home to Korea, Michelle told Peter she would like to get married. Although he was hesitant at first, he soon came round. As soon as Michelle arrived in Korea, she found her mother had a high fever and decided to take her to hospital. Chongmi's condition got progressively worse, but Michelle still took her Korean dishes to eat every day. Michelle thought that her marriage to Peter might have a positive effect on her mother's health, so she started to organize the wedding. Kai managed to convince Michelle's mother to convert to Christianity, even though she had never been a very religious woman. She did, however, believe in reincarnation and wanted to come back in her next life as a tree. On the day of Peter and Michelle's wedding, Chongmi was over the moon, even though she was becoming increasingly unwell. One morning, she woke up in unbearable pain and uttered what would turn out to be her last words. Ah, which means it hurts in Korean. Michelle and her father gave Chongmi her medication and took care of her while waiting for nature to take its course. Michelle's mother died with her daughter and husband by her side. Before anyone else arrived, Michelle decided to take a photo from above and film the scene with her father and Peter at her mother's bedside. Michelle's father then removed the wedding ring from his wife's finger and placed it on Michelle's right hand. Michelle chose a beautiful dress and dressed her mother, but the experience was emotionally devastating. Later, in order to take her mind off everything, she went to Dietering Orchids with Peter, a farm that grew seasonal fruit where she used to go with her father every October. She chose to go there because it was one of the few places where she had no memories of her mother. The funeral and the trip to Vietnam with her father. Michelle decided to write lovely mother, wife and best friend on her mother's headstone, as lovely was one of her mother's favorite words. While her father made the funeral arrangements, Michelle struggled to write the eulogy. Nami Imo and Seong Young also came from Korea to attend the funeral, which was a Christian service. This was a huge surprise to Michelle, and she regretted not getting more involved in the organization. She then saw that the tombstone said loving and not lovely, and she got so angry that she ordered the most expensive dish on the entire menu at dinner, crying the whole evening. Before Nami Imo and Seong Young returned to Seoul, she decided to cook doenjang jjigae, a typical Korean dish, for them. She looked for a recipe on YouTube, put on her mother's sandals, and went to Sunrise Market to buy all the ingredients. When she served the dish, her aunt was really surprised and moved. Sometime later, she received a parcel containing a jade teapot that had belonged to her mother and a very touching letter from Chongmi's art teacher. This helped Michelle discover a new side to her mother, and she began to wonder if she might have got her own creativity from her. Their relationship, after all, had broken down just as they were getting to know each other. She decided she needed to get away for a little while, so she went on a trip to Vietnam with her father, traveling from Hanoi to Sapa by train. They were mistaken for a couple a few times, which mortified them both. One evening at a restaurant, her father embarrassed her by being rude and loudly telling the waitress that Michelle used to be a waitress too. The two got into an argument and Michelle left. She ended up in a live music venue, singing with the owner and telling them about the recent death of her mother. Thankfully, the rest of the journey proceeded smoothly and peacefully. One evening, she received a phone call that her father had been in an accident and was in the hospital. When the police learned about the family's recent loss, they accepted the story that her father had fallen asleep at the wheel and decided not to investigate further. Michelle was afraid that her father had caused the accident on purpose, but did not confront him and instead started cooking for him, making him delicious dishes such as lobster, which her mother had loved. Japanese Breakfast's first album. Just before Christmas, Peter, who had finished his lessons for the autumn term, also moved into the house with Michelle and her father. While looking for the Christmas decorations, Michelle stumbled upon a pair of baby shoes and was surprised to learn that her mother had kept a few items for a future grandchild. She decided to clear out the cupboards and get rid of all the clothes and other items that had belonged to her mother. After the holidays, she got a job in a pizzeria to keep herself busy before moving to New York with Peter. The job was tiring, but exactly what she needed to take her mind off things. Meanwhile, she started writing music and asked her friends Nick and Colin to join her and Peter in recording Psychopomp, their first album under the name Japanese Breakfast. Before moving to New York, Michelle and Peter went on a late honeymoon to Korea. While she was there, Michelle remembered her first words as a child, Uma and Mum, and realized that she had called her mum in both Korean and English. They spent time with Nami Imo, who prepared myeokguk for Michelle's birthday, a traditional birthday dish in honor of her mother. This was when Michelle began to realize how food allows people to pass down and preserve their culture. Michelle and Peter then traveled to Busan and Jeju Island, visiting all the places her mother would have liked to see with her before she died, reclaiming her Korean identity through cooking. The couple then went to stay with Peter's parents in Pennsylvania, and Michelle got an office job in Williamsburg. Meanwhile, she continued to follow Mangchi's Korean recipe channel on YouTube and learned to cook many different Korean dishes. She regularly shopped at Mart in Flushing, Pennsylvania, and began to make kimchi. She started by making cheonggak and tongbaichu, white radish and cabbage kimchi, respectively, and they were a huge success. It became a monthly habit, and her refrigerator quickly became full of jars containing kimchi at various stages of fermentation. About a year after her mother's death, Michelle's father put the family home up for sale because he wanted to move to Thailand. He sent Michelle a few items, including her mother's kimchi refrigerator, but since there was no room in her house, she left it with her in-laws. When she visited their house for Thanksgiving, however, she discovered that the fridge was actually full of hundreds of old family photos, and she realized that her mother had documented every moment of their life together. She knew that she could no longer be with her mother, but in that moment, she realized that she had to become more like her. So, before returning to New York, she spent a day at a Korean spa and had every treatment available, telling the staff her story and that she wanted to reconnect with her Koreanness. Accepting pain as a part of life. Michelle used one of her mother's photos on the cover of Psychopomp, which had been quite successful in the meantime, and then went on tour with Japanese-American singer-songwriter Mitski. She wrote an essay about her mother and her kimchi hobby in Glamour magazine and became a successful artist. Japanese Breakfast went on a world tour, including Asia and a final date in Seoul. When she arrived in Korea, she couldn't wait to eat the food she held so close to her heart and was thrilled that a crowd of people had gathered in her mother's hometown to listen to her band. Although Chongmi had never been overjoyed with Michelle's career in music, she wished that her mother could see how far she had come. After the concert, the band went to a club with John, the owner of the venue, and a friend of his, where they discussed the Korean pop scene of the 1960s. Later, Aunt Nami told Michelle about her mother's favorite song, Coffee Hanjan, which the two had often sung together as small girls. Michelle realized that her mother would always be alive in her memory and that she could continue to get to know her better through the memories of those who loved her. We see Michelle and Nami singing Coffee Hanjan together at karaoke, each trying in their own way to reconnect with Chongmi's memory. This concludes our analysis of Crying in Mart. If you would like to know more, you would no doubt enjoy the book. Meanwhile, here is a sneak preview with a selection of the book's key quotes. Life is unfair, and sometimes it helps to irrationally blame someone for it. There was no one in the world that was ever as critical or could make me feel as hideous as my mother, but there was no one, not even Peter, who ever made me feel as beautiful. What I never seem to forget is what my mother ate. Am I even Korean anymore if there's no one left to call and ask which brand of seaweed we used to buy? Every dish I cooked exhumed a memory. Every scent and taste brought me back for a moment to an unravaged home. And finally, before we close, let's do a quick recap of the book's take-home messages. When Michelle Zauner's mother died, she felt it robbed her of an important part of her own identity. As a Korean American, she feared that, with her mother's passing, her ties to her Korean heritage might also be severed. There is no right way to grieve and no right way to remember. When we remember someone who is no longer with us, our natural instinct is to ignore the difficult times we spent together and to create a new image of them. Michelle Zauner, however, leaves nothing out when remembering her mother and portrays her exactly as she remembered her, including her most unpleasant side. She does not try to make her appear sweeter or nicer in the eyes of the reader, but describes her as a human being with all her flaws. Food is a fundamental part of a people's cultural identity, and it is the only thing that allows Michelle to be herself and find self-acceptance. In today's society, success is determined by the majority, so there is not much room for minorities who, like Michelle, have to work twice as hard, on the inside and on the outside, to achieve the same results.